My daughter left the recorder on the kitchen table 3 weeks after Frank Deschamps died, and she said, "Dad, you can just talk into it whenever you feel ready." And then she drove back to terrace, and I sat in this chair for 2 days and did not touch it. That was in April. It is now the 14th of June, and I am 74 years old. And the recorder has been sitting here long enough that I put a coffee ring on the case, which I am sorry about. My name is Gideon Hartley. I guided on the Skeena River and its tributaries for 41 years, from the spring of 1978 until I sold my license in the fall of 2019. I know that river the way some men know a face they have lived beside. The high water marks on the cottonwood bark, the gravel bars that shift in late July, the exact bend above Hazelton where the sockeye hold in the first week of September, when the water temperature drops to what it needs to be. I have logged more than 6,000 days on that water. I am telling you this because what I am about to say requires that you understand what kind of witness I am. I am not a man who mistakes a bear for something else in poor light. I am not a man who saw a shape in the mist and built a story around it. I am a man who reads moving water for a living, who reads weather and current, and the behavior of animals by what they do and do not do, and who kept a secret for 32 years because I gave my word to Frank Deschamps, and because I believed, and still believe, that silence was the correct thing. Frank died on the 8th of March of this year. He was 79. It was his heart, which had been asking questions for a decade, and it finally got its answer on a Tuesday morning in the hospital at Smithers. His daughter Mireille called me, and I sat on the back step with the phone in my hand for a long time after, looking at the spruce. He was my partner for 38 years. He was the only other living person who knew the full shape of what I am going to tell you. He made me promise to keep it while he was alive, and I kept it, and now he is gone, and I am the last one who was there for all of it. And I have a recorder on my kitchen table, and a daughter who wants to know why her father has been carrying something heavy since before she was born. This is what I am telling the recorder. I came to the Skeena in 1977 by accident, which is to say I came because I had no good reason to be anywhere else. I was 26 years old, and I had worked 3 years on a survey crew in the Peace River country, and I had saved enough money to do nothing useful for a winter, and a man I'd known since high school told me he was guiding steelhead on the Skeena, and did I want to come up and see it? I saw it. That is all I can say about what happens when you first stand on the bank of that river in October, with the cottonwoods, yellow, and the mountains, coming down to the water, and a 30-inch fish holding in the current 20 feet in front of you. I was back in April, and I never left. I bought a guiding license in 1978, and I spent the first 2 seasons learning the water under a man named Archie Prentice, who had been guiding that stretch since 1961, and who died in 1994, having never, to my knowledge, seen anything on that river that he could not name. Frank Deschamps came up from Prince George in 1981 to fish as a client, and I guided him for 4 days. And at the end of those 4 days, he asked me what it would cost to stay. He was 46 years old. He had just sold his plumbing supply business, and he had decided he was finished doing things he did not love. We were partners by 1982. We ran the lodge together for 27 years, before I bought out his half, when his knees gave out in 2009, and I kept guiding until my eyes told me it was time. I am telling you about Frank at this length because you need to understand that he was not a credulous man. He was a methodical man, a practical man, a man who had spent 30 years reading pipes and fittings and the pressures of things, moving through confined spaces. He was, in his way, as precise as I was, and he saw it too. I need you to know that. The first time was a morning in August of 1982. I had been guiding the lodge for 2 full seasons by then, and I knew that stretch of the Skeena well enough to walk it in the dark, which is very nearly what I was doing on that particular morning. It was 4:45, and I had a client booked for 5:30, a man from Calgary who had requested an early start because he believed the fish were more active in the first light, which is sometimes true and sometimes simply a preference dressed as fact. I was walking the bank to check a gravel bar I wanted to position him on. Because a guide does not take a client to water, he has not scouted that morning. Conditions change overnight, and a good guide does not surprise himself. The sky was the colour that comes before colour, a pale grey with a faint pink pressure building in the east, and the river was audible but not visible, which is a specific quality of that time of morning that I have never been able to properly describe to anyone who has not stood there. I heard the river before I saw it, and I felt the cold coming off it, and I came around the last bend of the bank trail and stopped. There was something standing in the shallows. I have been asked to describe this moment many times in my own head, and I will try to describe it accurately here, which means I will tell you what I saw, and I will not tell you what I decided it was, because I did not decide anything. Not that morning. What I saw was a figure that was large in a way that registered as wrong before I could account for it, the way a shadow on a wall is wrong before you understand what is casting it. It was standing in water that came to my thigh, and the water came to its knee. It was facing slightly away from me, looking up the river, and it was still in the way that very large things are still, with a weight to its stillness that is different from the stillness of smaller things. Dark brown, broad across the back and shoulders in a way that I kept trying to locate a reference for and could not. The arms were long. I could see the breath coming off it in the cold air, a slow plume, and it was breathing as steadily as something asleep. I stood there, I do not know how long. Long enough for the pink in the east to become definite. And then it turned, not quickly, not startled, but as though it had decided it was time, and it looked at me directly. And I would say there was a moment of mutual recognition, except that implies I had some frame for what I was recognizing, which I did not. Its eyes were dark and calm. There was nothing in them that required me to run. That is the most precise thing I can say about it. Then it walked, unhurried, across the shallows to the far bank and into the timber. And it was gone, before the light was strong enough to show me where it had gone. I stood on the bank for a long time. I went back to the lodge. I guided my client that morning, and I did not tell him what I had seen, and I did not tell anyone for 3 years. The reason I did not tell anyone was not fear, and it was not confusion, though I had both of those in some measure. The reason I did not tell anyone was that I did not have the word for it that was equal to what it had been, and I was not willing to use the words that were available, because those words all came attached to things I did not believe it was. I had read enough by then to know what category the available language would put it in, and that category was not serious, and what I had seen on that gravel bar was serious. So I kept it and I watched. For 3 years I kept it and I watched. I changed which stretches I walked before dawn. I changed when I walked them. I found 6 more places along that 14-kilometer stretch where the ground told me that something very large had stood or walked, and the ground does not lie to a man who has spent years reading it. Large depressions in soft bank mud, twice, that I measured with my hand and my arm and committed to memory, because I had not yet learned to carry a notebook for this purpose. The size was consistent. The stride was consistent. Whatever it was one thing, and it was resident, and it was careful in a way that suggested it had been careful for a long time. Frank saw it in September of 1985. He came to find me in the equipment shed at 7 in the evening, and he stood in the door for a moment before he said anything, and I knew from the way he was standing that he had seen something. He was a methodical man, and he was trying to be methodical about what he said next, which took him a moment. He told me he had been walking the cottonwood bar, the one we called that, because of the 3 large cottonwoods at the north end, checking a snag that had come down in the high water 2 days before, and he had found it crouching at the water's edge, with its back to him, doing something with its hands in the shallows that he could not identify from 60 feet. He had stood still, he said. He had not made a sound. He described the size. He described the color. He described the way it eventually rose and walked upstream without acknowledging him, which he said had frightened him more than being acknowledged would have, because it meant either that it did not regard him as a threat or that it did not regard him at all, and he could not tell which. He sat down on the stool by the workbench when he finished. I got the coffee from the shelf and poured 2 cups, and I told him that I had first seen 3 years before. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "So we are not going to tell the clients?" I said, "No." He said, "And we are not going to call anyone?" I said, "No." He held the cup in both hands and looked at the steam coming off it for a moment. And then he said, "All right," and that was the compact. It was that simple, and it held for 34 years. Frank was a practical man. The lodge ran on that stretch of river for 27 years, and in those years I guided 111 clients on Steelhead and 4 seasons of Chinook and 2 specialty groups for Dolly Varden, and not one of those clients saw it. I do not believe this was entirely a matter of luck. I changed certain patterns after 1985, quietly, without explaining my reasons. There were stretches I stopped taking clients to before full light. There were gravel bars I described as fished out when they were not. There were mornings I redirected without explanation, saying the water was wrong, saying I had a feeling, and a guide who has been on a river long enough can say such things and be believed. There was one occasion when I came close to losing that record. In July of 1991, I had a client named Stan Merritt, a structural engineer from Seattle, a careful and observant man who asked good questions and who moved quietly on the water, which is a quality I always respected. We were working a run above the island bar on a grey morning, and I was watching Stan cast, and I was also watching, as I always was watching by then, the far bank, and I saw it standing in the alders 200 feet up the bank, completely still, watching us. Stan had his back to it. I considered what to do, and I had approximately 30 seconds to consider it, because Stan was going to rotate his position in the next cast, and the alders were sparse enough that what I could see, he could see. I told him I had spotted a fish moving downstream, which was not entirely false, because there was a fish somewhere, as there always was. I simply had not spotted it. I moved him 40 feet south, and kept him casting at a different angle, and by the time he had made 3 casts, the alders were empty. Stan caught nothing that morning and was gracious about it. He sent a thank you note to the lodge in October. I kept it because I liked him and because it seemed in some way like an artifact of a near thing. There was a woman named Delphine Carr who cooked at the lodge from 1984 to 1997. She was 58 when she started, and 71 when her hips finally ended the arrangement, and she had come up from Smithers, where she had cooked for the school district for 20 years, and before that, for a bush camp near Dease Lake. She was a large woman with a slow manner and a precise economy of motion in a kitchen, and she fed 22 clients at a sitting, without apparent difficulty, and never once served anything that was less than correct. I did not tell her about the creature, she told me. In the fall of 1986, about a year after Frank and I had made our arrangement, Delphine stopped me in the lodge hallway after the morning's clients had gone out, and she said, in a tone that was so flat, it took me a moment to understand its weight, that there was something coming to the gravel bar at night and eating the fish scraps she left on the flat rock near the water. I said I knew. She said, it is very large. I said, yes. She said, it is not a bear. I said, no, it is not. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, all right. And she went back into the kitchen, and from that day on the pile of scraps she left on the flat rock was larger and more carefully arranged. She never asked me another question about it, and I never volunteered another word. And when she died, in the winter of 2016, I drove to Smithers for her funeral, and I sat in the back of the church, and I thought about all the evenings she had walked to that rock and back without telling a single one of the clients what she knew. There are people whose loyalty is like the river, which is to say, it does not stop, and it does not explain itself, and it does not ask for acknowledgement. Delphine Carr was one of those people. The dog's name was Pepper. She was a red tick hound, Frank's dog originally, 7 years old when she came to the lodge in 1985, and 13 when she died there in 1991. She is relevant to this account because her behavior on the gravel bar was, over the years, one of the things I watched most carefully. Pepper was a good dog in the sense that she responded accurately to the world. She barked at things she did not recognize and was silent about things she did. And she had strong opinions about bear scent and about strange men who moved too quickly. She met a black bear at close range in 1987, and her reaction was unmistakable and immediate. Her reaction to the creature was different. In the 3 or 4 occasions when I observed them within range of each other, which happened in the early mornings on the gravel bar, when I was present and watching, Pepper did not bark. She did not approach. She sat down, very deliberately, in a way that was almost formal, and she watched with her ears up and her body still, and when it was gone, she went back to whatever she had been doing before. I have thought about that a great deal. A dog's judgment is not infallible, but it is not wrong in the ways that people are wrong. It does not construct a story around what it sees. It responds to what is actually there. Pepper sat down in its presence the way she sat down in the presence of people she had decided were all right. I do not know what to do with that, except to say it. After Pepper, there was a blue heeler named Silt, who was mine from 1993, and who had the same response, the same formal sitting, the same watchful stillness, and I found this repetition across 2 different dogs of 2 different breeds and 2 different temperaments to be the most reliable data I had. Silt was with me on the morning in 1993, when I first understood that the creature could be hurt. It was late May of 1993, the high water season, the river running fast and cold and brown with snowmelt, and I was walking the lower bank at dawn for reasons that were by then partly professional and partly something else. Partly the habit of attention that the previous 11 years had made in me. Silt was at my heel, which was unusual for her on the morning walk. She preferred to range ahead. She was staying close, and that was information. I came through the cottonwood, break onto the flat section of the upper bank, and I saw it in the long grass between the bank and the timber, and it was lying on its side. I stopped. Silt stopped. The creature did not move. My first thought, which I am not proud of, was that it was dead, and the feeling that came with that thought was not what I expected. It was grief, a sharp and specific grief which surprised me because I had always believed I was a careful observer of this thing, and not an attached one, and I discovered in that moment that I was wrong about the distinction. Then I saw the chest moving. It was breathing. It was breathing shallowly, and its right leg was extended at an angle that was wrong. And when I looked more carefully, I could see the leg was injured, the knee, or just below it, a swelling I could make out even at the distance I was keeping. I stood there for a long time. It opened its eyes once and looked at me and closed them again. I backed away slowly and I went to find Frank. What Frank and I did over the next 3 weeks is the part of this that I find hardest to describe with the precision it deserves. Because what we did was, in practical terms, simple, and yet it felt like nothing I had ever been asked to do before. We moved the lodge's daily operations upstream, away from the lower bank entirely, telling the clients that the fish were holding differently this season, which was partly true. We increased what was left on the flat rock. Frank went down each morning at first light to observe, which was his contribution, and he was always back before the clients were up. On the 8th day, Frank told me that the swelling was less. On the 14th day, he told me that it had been standing. On the 21st day, it was gone from the long grass, and 2 mornings later, I found a pile of river stones arranged in a configuration I could not explain on the flat rock beside the usual flat rock. 3 large stones and 1 smaller one, placed with a deliberateness that the river did not produce. I have thought about those stones for 30 years. I do not know what they meant. I know they were placed. I know that is all I know, and I am not willing to add to what I know. Walt O'Callig was a Wet'suwet'en man who had a trap line in the country above the upper lodge, and who came through our stretch of the river 2 or 3 times a year, sometimes stopping to take a cup of coffee, and sometimes just lifting a hand from his canoe as he went past. He was in his 60s when I first knew him, and he died in 2004 at a great age, and with his mind entirely intact, which I know because I was at the hospital in the last weeks. And we talked about the river and about the fish, and about the changes he had seen in 50 years of working that country. He never talked about the creature directly. In all the years I knew him, there was only one occasion when anything close to that topic passed between us, and it was brief, and it was in the autumn of 1989, on the riverbank at the end of a long afternoon when I had been watching a particular bend for steelhead, and he had paddled up from downstream and pulled his canoe out to rest. We sat together for a while in the way that men who have spent a great deal of time outdoors can sit together without needing to fill the air. And then, not looking at me, looking at the river, he said something that I have carried for 35 years. He said, in a voice so quiet that I had to be certain I had heard it correctly, that his grandfather's people had a word for them, and that the word meant something closer to neighbor than to anything else, and that his grandfather had said the right way was to behave as though you had a neighbor who valued their privacy. Then he was quiet again, and after a while he got back in his canoe and went downstream, and we never spoke of it again. I did not ask him to say more. I have sometimes wished I had, and I have sometimes been glad I did not. His grandfather's word. I have thought about that word, though I do not know it and could not say it, for 35 years. Neighbor. That is the closest I have come to a name for it, and it is not my name to give. That is why I will not name it. That is the answer to the question my daughter asked me before she left the recorder on the table. She said, "Dad, is it what people say it is?" And I said there is a word that belongs to this place and to the people who have been here longer than I have. And that word is not mine to use, and any other word brings along with it a set of ideas that are not accurate to what I know. What I know is this. For 32 years, something lived in and moved through the country along that stretch of the Skeena River, and it was large, and it was careful, and it was present in the way that a neighbor is present, which is to say, you know they are there, and they know you are there, and most of the time, you both go about your separate business without requiring anything formal from the other. That is what it was. It was a neighbor, and I cannot improve on a word that someone's grandfather chose. The acknowledgement happened in the fall of 2001. I have thought about it for 23 years, and I will try to say it correctly. It was October, a clear, cold morning, the larches gone yellow on the slopes above the river, and the water low and blue-green, the way it gets in the fall when the sediment has settled, and you can see the bottom at 8 feet. I was alone on the bank. Frank was at the lodge, with a group that had come in the night before, and I had gone out early to mark the best water for the next morning's fishing. Silt was with me. I had been on the bank for perhaps 40 minutes, working my way down from the island bar, and I came around the last bend before the long flat at the Cottonwood bar. And I stopped because something in the way Silt moved, a small tightening of her walk, told me to. She did not sit down immediately this time. She slowed, and then she sat, and I looked to the tree line across the flat, and it was standing there, at the edge of the timber, in full sight, in the morning light, which was unusual. It had been in all my years of seeing it, a creature of low light and partial cover. It stood fully upright, and it looked at me across the distance of the flat, which I would estimate at 80 feet, perhaps 90. And then, slowly, it lowered its head. Not a bow, not a human gesture restated in a larger body. Something that had the quality of a bow without being one, a lowering of the very large head, deliberate and held for a moment, and then raised again. And then it turned and went into the timber. I stood on the bank with Silt beside me, and I did not move for a long time. I did not speak about it to Frank that day. I did not speak about it for several days. When I finally told him, at the end of the week, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said he thought that was the right thing for it to have done. I have thought about that gesture for 23 years, and I have only one interpretation of it, which is that it had known I was there for 20 years, and that it was marking in the only way available to it, that it knew. That is all. That it knew, and that it had decided at that particular morning that I should know it knew. I do not have language for what that meant to me. I will not pretend to. The years after that were the long middle of it, which is the part that is hardest to tell, because it is not a series of events, but a condition, a way of living that had become ordinary. I guided the lodge through the late 90s and into the 2000s, and the creature was present in the country the way the river was present, which is to say, I did not go a week without awareness of it, and yet most of that awareness was simply the knowledge that it was there. The flat rock became a habit rather than a gesture. I left the cleaned fish scraps there the way I left the porch light on, as a matter of course, and most mornings I did not check whether they had been taken because I did not need to. The checking itself had become the point. The walk to the rock in the early morning, the cold air off the river, the gravel bar still grey before the light reached it. That walk was the practice. And the practice was a way of staying in relation to something I could not fully account for, and had decided I did not need to. I changed my practices on the water, and I kept those changes in place, and no client ever asked a question I could not answer with a version of the truth. In 29 years of guiding that stretch, I had perhaps 11 direct sightings of the creature, and perhaps 35 occasions when I found sign that I attributed to it. And the sum of those occasions was a certainty about the country that I have never been able to hand to anyone who was not already there. Nora knew. I told Nora, my wife, in the winter of 1996, not because I could no longer keep it, but because I could no longer keep it from her, which is a different thing. We had been married 15 years. She was a practical woman from Hazleton, who had grown up on the river, and who did not need things to make sense to her in order to accept them. She listened to the whole account sitting at this same kitchen table, and when I was done, she said, "That explains some things about your mornings." And then she made tea. She never asked to see it. She never came to the gravel bar for that purpose. She accepted it the way she accepted a great many things about life on that river as a condition of the place that did not require her commentary. She died in 2009, a summer cancer, fast, and the morning after her funeral, I walked the lower bank alone at first light, and I do not know what I was looking for, and I did not find it. And I went back to the lodge, and I did not cry until I was in the equipment shed by myself, which is how I have always managed such things. The creature came to the lodge's gravel bar for the last time that I can confirm in the summer of 2011. I know this because the flat rock received nothing after that summer. The scraps I left went untouched. The depressions in the bank mud stopped appearing. The fish scraps Delphine had been leaving, or that I had been leaving after Delphine left, remained where I placed them. I did not know it was the last time until months had passed, and the pattern had changed irrevocably, and by then I understood that something had shifted. The lodge had been sold the previous year, in 2010, to a partnership from Vancouver that wanted to run a higher-end operation and had different ideas about what the water was for. And it is possible that the changed rhythms of the place, the different people, the different smells and sounds, had altered something in the calculation of a being that had been careful for a very long time. I do not know. I continued to guide for the new owners as a contract guide for 3 more seasons, and I walked the lower bank when I could, and I found nothing that told me it was still using that stretch. The last time I saw it with any certainty was in June of 2014. I was alone in a canoe on an evening when I had told myself I was checking the water conditions for the next day, and I knew, even then, that this was not entirely true. I came around the bend above the Cottonwood Bar in the low evening light, and it was on the far bank, moving through the alders, not quickly, moving the way it always moved, which was with the unhurried directness of something that knew exactly where it was going. It did not look at me. It moved through the alders and was gone, and the alder branches settled back into stillness, and the river ran on. I sat in the canoe for a while. Then I paddled back to the launch. That was the last time. I am aware that there are people who would want more from this account than I am able to give them. I am aware that there are people who would want a name, a category, a confirmation or a denial, and I cannot provide any of those things with the honesty this account requires. What I know is what I observed over 32 years on a specific stretch of the Skeena River, in the company of a specific set of people who kept a specific secret. And what I observed was a being of great size and great caution that lived in the country alongside us, and that treated us, over time, as Walt Okulik's grandfather's word suggested it might, as neighbors. It did not harm anyone. It did not threaten anyone. It moved through the world with a dignity that I can only describe as the dignity of something that has been in a place for a very long time and intends to remain there. And that has worked out over however many years, a way of being in that place that includes the presence of people without requiring anything of them and without giving them cause for anything other than wonder. I keep coming back to that word, wonder. It is not a strong enough word for what it was, and it is the strongest accurate word I have. Frank Deschamps died on the 8th of March of this year at the hospital in Smithers, with his daughter Mireille and his son-in-law at his side. He was a good man and a reliable partner, and he kept his word for 34 years. I am keeping mine by telling this now, which is what he asked me to do. When he knew the end was close, he said, "Gideon, when I am gone, you should tell someone who will keep it right. I do not know if I am telling it right. I am telling it accurately, which is the only thing I know how to do. The flat rock is still on the gravel bar at the lower lodge. I drove past it last September. The new owners have built a dock and added lighting, and the gravel bar is different now. But the rock is still there, half embedded in the bank. The one Delphine always left the fish scraps on, the one where the arrangement of 3 stones appeared in the spring of 1993. I did not stop. I looked at it from the road and I drove on. The river was running well for September. The cottonwoods were just starting to turn. Somewhere in the country above that bend, or in the country north of it, or in the country west, where the mountains go back further than the maps want to acknowledge. Something very large and very careful is going about its life in the way it has always done. I do not know that, but I believe it. There is a difference between those two things, and I have spent 40 years learning to respect that difference. And I am not going to stop now.